about to hear was recorded at the Poetry Center of the New York YMYWHA on December 2nd, 1963. This program presents Professor Walter Kaufmann of Princeton University lecturing on Oedipus Rex. A fuller commentary on this subject may be obtained by reading Mr. Kaufmann's book, Tragedy and Philosophy, published by Doubleday and Company.
Tonight, I want to speak about Sophocles' play, King Oedipus, also known as Oedipus Rex or Oedipus Tyrannus. Sophocles was born about 496 and died at the age of 90, 406. He was born at Colonus, the place in which he set his last play, the Oedipus in Colonus, and his relation in age to Aeschylus is often presented by the fact that Aeschylus fought in the Battle of Marathon in Salamis, and that Sophocles was not old enough to fight but danced in the victory dance, while Euripides was born in 480. Sophocles won his first victory in 468, defeating Aeschylus. He wrote a total of at least 120 plays and won 24 victories. 24 victories, since each involved 4 plays, means that of his at least 120 plays, 96 won first prize. The remaining 24, 6 sets of 4, won second prize. He never placed third. He was very popular generally and was twice elected general, the first time with Pericles and the second time with Nicias, both times in august company. The story goes that the first time he was elected general in 440 because the Athenians were so impressed by his Antigone that had been performed the year before. Sophocles was also a priest of a healing deity, but the name was as doubtful, and he also wrote a prose work on the chorus. When he died at the age of 90, Phrynichus wrote about him, "Thus happily ended a life without one mishap." And Sophocles has been called, ever since antiquity, sweet-tempered, oikolos, and gentle. In the Loeb edition, the bilingual edition in which the Greek texts appear on the left side and translations on facing pages, the translator, Storr, writes in his editorial introduction, "The one aspersion on Sophocles' character is that in his younger days he was a passionate lover. But the charge rests on a passage in the opening scene of the Republic of Plato which will bear a milder interpretation, that old age had removed him from temptations to which he may never have succumbed." I find this rather amusing, but what in any case it suggests to us is that, in fact, nothing bad has ever been said against Sophocles. Even what Plato says about him is hardly bad. On the other hand, the usual picture of him, implicit to some slight extent in what little I have said, seems to me very seriously misleading. The sweet-tempered, gentle Sophocles, who is pictured for us more or less as the embodiment of what Matthew Arnold called, when speaking about Greek culture, sweetness and light. That is not at all the way I see Sophocles. But let Matthew Arnold have his inning first, and let's quote what Matthew Arnold said beautifully, and some of the words at least probably most of you know, in a sonnet that is called "To a Friend," and that was first published in 1849. The sonnet begins, "Who prop, thou ask'st, in these bad days my mind? And then after he talks of some other people who prop his mind in these bad days, he ends the sonnet as follows. But be his my special thanks, whose even-balanced soul from first youth tested up to extreme old age, business could not make dull, nor passion wild, who saw life steadily and saw it whole, the mellow glory of the Attic stage, singer of sweet Colonus and its child. This idea of Sophocles as sweetness and light seems to me just a little like seeing Jeremiah or the author of Job as sweetness and light. And while it is true that a successful life of 90 years in which one was so popular and triumphed so many times may create some presumption that here was a life full of satisfactions and free of violence, it is interesting that in that last play, Oedipus on Colonus, the one that leads Matthew Arnold to speak of singer of Colonus, there's a famous chorus which, in a way, as far as the plot goes, is dispensable, unless Sophocles felt like saying it. And I'll read it to you in a very literal translation that jars a bit. It's out of the Loeb's editions because of the jingling rhymes. Who craves excess of days, scorning the common span of life, I judge that man a giddy wight who walks in folly's ways. For the long years heap up a grievous load, scant pleasures, heavier pains, till not one joy remains for him who lingers on life's weary road, and come it slow or fast. One doom of fate doth all await, for dance and marriage bell, the dirge and funeral knell, death, the deliverer, freeth all at last. Not to be born at all is best, far best that can befall. Next best, when born, with least delay, to trace the backward way. The Oedipus on Colonus and the Oedipus Tyrannus, about which I want to speak tonight, and the Antigone that deals with one of Oedipus' daughters, do not form a trilogy. They have been published in that form as the Theban plays, which is unobjectionable, but to call them a Theban trilogy would be a great mistake. It is in many ways an important point. The first thing that's important about it is that I suggested last time, in the first lecture of this series, that Aeschylus and Sophocles between them created tragedy, and that it is not quite right to say that it was Aeschylus who created tragedy. To be sure, before Aeschylus, there was just the chorus and one actor conversing with the chorus. It was Aeschylus who introduced the second actor and thereby made possible something more like what we would call a play, a tragedy. But Aeschylus wrote trilogies, and Sophocles did not write trilogies. To be sure, he wrote also sets of 4 plays that were performed together, but they did not have any continuity. When he performed the Oedipus Tyrannus, he performed it together with 2 other tragedies and 1 satyr play that bore no connection with this one. While Aeschylus wrote trilogies that had a continuity, one of which has survived, the Oresteia, where indeed we do not have the satyr play, but we have 3 plays that form a unity. And perhaps I may even anticipate to say that in this unity in Aeschylus, the tragic ending, if any, of the first play is usually resolved by the time we get to the end of the whole. It was Sophocles who first wrote a single play, a single tragedy, tragedy in the sense in which we know it, that is self-contained from beginning to end. When Aeschylus dealt with this same theme, about which I want to talk tonight, he wrote a first tragedy that was called Laios, after the father of Oedipus, a second one that was called Oedipus. Both of these are lost. A third play that was called Seven Against Thebes, which is extant. And finally, a satyr play called The Sphinx. And Aeschylus' satyr plays apparently were hilarious, which is a little hard for us today to imagine since we don't have any, but they had a great reputation. On the other hand, Sophocles first wrote his Antigone, which is the play that when the three are presented in one volume comes last. And as I mentioned before, that was first performed in 441. Then much later in 425, his Oedipus Tyrannus was performed, and his Oedipus on Colonus he finished just before his death in 406, and it was first performed posthumously. To suppose that he felt very bothered as he wrote the two later plays by what he had already written on the same sort of theme before is, I think, to overlook that, as I mentioned before, he wrote at least 120 plays. And in these 120 plays, since for the most part they dealt with Greek legends, there was a very limited amount of material, and there's every reason to believe, as well as considerable evidence, that he did not feel committed by what he had done 20 or more years before. Not only is the character of Creon quite different in the three plays, he appears in all three, but there are also very violent inconsistencies in the plot between these three plays. And it would be foolish to hold him accountable for it, because this is, to say it just once more, not a trilogy, but they are three independent plays. The plot was extremely popular, not only in Sophocles' time. For all I know, he may have been one of the first to deal with it after Aeschylus, but there has been a vast number of Oedipus plays ever since. 12 Greek poets, in addition to Sophocles, wrote Oedipus tragedies. Of these I'll mention just two besides Aeschylus, namely Euripides and Meletus, who was one of the accusers of Socrates. Among the Romans who wrote on this same theme were Julius Caesar and Seneca. And in later times, among the people who wrote tragedies on Oedipus were Voltaire and Corneille and Dryden and Lee, and closer to our time, Hugo von Hofmannsthal. I will not make any comparisons with these others, but I will briefly say something about the story before Sophocles and make one comparison with one treatment after, but I'll be brief about it, because what concerns me about this is merely to bring out the immense originality of Sophocles' treatment. First of all, let us begin with a passage, several lines, 10 lines, from the Odyssey, the 11th canto, lines 271 following. And I saw the mother of Oedipus, fair Epicaste, who wrought a monstrous deed in ignorance, wedding her son, and he, having slain his own father, wedded her. And straightway the gods made this known among men. Yet he abode as lord of the Cadmeans in lovely Thebes, suffering woes through the baneful counsels of the gods, while she went down to the house of Hades, the strong warder. She made fast a noose on high from a lofty beam, overpowered by her sorrow, but for him she left behind woes full many, all that the avengers of a mother bring about. In this early tradition, then, the mother does commit suicide. Her name is not Jocasta, but Epicaste. But the king goes on with woes which are not specified as king of the Cadmeans in lovely Thebes. Another reference that we find occurs in the Iliad, Canto 23, lines 679 and 80, where it is mentioned that somebody had come to Thebes for the burial of Oedipus when he had fallen and there had worsted all the sons of Cadmus, suggesting that at the end of a long life, he finally fell in battle, and there was a big funeral, there being then reference to the games that were played at Oedipus' funeral. After Homer, the same theme was treated in two of the cyclic epics, one of them the Thebaios, dealing with the Theban stories, and the other one the Oedipodeia. And in these, Oedipus' second wife is the mother of his children, which suggests a kind of moral censorship that's just too horrible that it should have been Jocasta who was the mother of his children. As I mentioned, both Aeschylus and Euripides wrote tragedies on Oedipus, and we have a fragment of Euripides' play on Oedipus, and there Oedipus is blinded, not by himself, but by Laius' servants, the servants of his father. In Pindar's Olympic Odes, 2 lines 38 following, fate is emphasized. His fated son encountered Laius and slew him, fulfilling the oracle spoken in Pytho long before. The most detailed treatment of comparable antiquity that has survived is in Euripides' Phoenician Maidens, where in the prologue the whole story is recounted at great length, and then toward the end, in lines 1595 following, Oedipus makes a long speech, from which I'll quote a few lines right now. Of this speech, it is not certain that the speech is really by Euripides, although the play certainly is authentic. It is generally believed that there are long interpolations in it, added by later poets. And here we get an emphasis that is quite different, certainly, from that which we will in a moment find in Sophocles. O fate, you bred me wretched from the start, says Oedipus, and then after a few lines, so when ill-fated I had killed my father, I came into my wretched mother's bed and begot brothers whom I now have killed, passing on to my children Laius' curse. For I am not so foolish in my nature as to do what I did to my eyes and to their lives, if it were not some god who had contrived it. The two emphases we find here in these lines is, again, the emphasis on fate, and specifically the accusation of the wicked gods. When we turn to Aeschylus' play 7 Against Thebes, which deals with the story that leads up to two of the sons killing each other, there's again a stress on the theme of hereditary guilt. The son paid for the father's sin, and this surely was prominent throughout that particular trilogy, which begins with a tragedy on Laius and traces the family curse to the final killing of the two brothers. Now, when we turn to Sophocles, I think we get some clue to what Aristotle meant when he said that the plot was the life and soul of the tragedy. As I already suggested in my first lecture, I don't think his meaning was the Philistine one of suggesting that the story is what matters. I think what he means is what matters is what the poet does with the story. The story in itself could be handled in a way the way it was by Euripides in the Phoenician Maidens, with everything thrown in, as it were the works. Everything in that story that has dramatic or melodramatic potentialities is present there. Now, obviously, what Sophocles does is something that is quite different, and quite different in obvious respects from some of the things that I have just mentioned. Oedipus does not live on as king afterwards, but he blinds himself and In the end, it is not quite clear whether he is about to leave the city or whether he will still stay a little while. It is his own mother who is the mother of his children. He's not blinded by larger servants, but by himself. And as I think I can show to some extent as we go into it, fate is not emphasized nearly as much as it is in some of the other treatments. The most obvious originality, of course, is the immense compression in time. Everything happens within a few hours. And Sophocles chooses which few hours in the life of Oedipus can be used for maximum effect. In addition to being able to compress the whole action into a few hours' time in the life of Oedipus, he gets along with very few characters: Oedipus himself, Jocasta, Tiresias the seer, Creon, and with smaller roles, a speech by a priest, a shepherd, 2 messengers, and of course a chorus. Only one place is needed. It's all before the palace in Thebes. The action is as compact probably as in any great play ever written, and throughout a maximum of excitement and tension is maintained. If there's one thing that one can single out in one word as being exceptionally terrifying and at the same time specifically Sophoclean, it is the ironies of the play. I will give one important illustration of that in a few minutes. Oedipus himself is a magnificent character. I'll have something to say about the character, and I think strikes anyone who reads the play as singularly consistent as a character. It is the play, incidentally, before I start on some interpretations now, that I have seen more often than any other play on the stage, which is not merely a personal matter, perhaps to mention, but when I instance where I have seen it, I think it will give you some idea of its still very universal appeal. I've seen it twice in Princeton in different places, once in Germany performed in German, once in a film treatment in a translation by William Butler Yeats, once in Warsaw in Poland with music by Stravinsky, and once in Vienna in the translation into German made by the German poet Hölderlin with music by Orff. So it gives some idea of how different audiences in different countries, and also men of such genius as Hölderlin, Stravinsky, and Orff, have felt the immense appeal of this particular story. The performances were by no means all equally good, but I have found that in any performance whatsoever, it was blood-curdling. Now let us consider some interpretations that I do not find entirely satisfactory, some worse than others, but most of which I think see something that at least is worth emphasizing before I want to develop some points that have often been overlooked. The first interpretation is the one already alluded to. It is the one that makes the tragedy a tragedy of fate. Now, this obviously is not entirely wrong. If one would tell the story, if one were called on to tell somebody who hadn't heard the story before, I suppose this element of fate would be one that one could hardly avoid introducing into the story. It is an important element, and anybody who listened to the story, having it told to him, would probably be particularly struck by this. There's the prophecy to the parents of what the son will do. In order to escape this fate, they expose the son, and then through several other similar twists where Oedipus tries not to fulfill the fate of which he is at intervals in his life reminded that it is his fate, through trying to escape this fate, he ultimately fulfills it. That this element is present in the story is undeniable. But precisely because it is so strongly present in the story, I find it doubly impressive how little Sophocles makes of this. He can't get away from it completely because it's there in the story, but it is clearly not the thing that he harps on. And what is unprofound to my mind about this particular perspective on his play is that if you look at it that way, you have to say this is a very singular, a very marvelous, a very horrible, a very exceptional fate. And what you lose in that case is the representative quality of the drama. It becomes a story of somebody who was tricked in a way in which, well, probably nobody else has ever been tricked, and one can then perhaps think of some other remotely comparable instances in which something almost equally exceptional has happened to other people, but it still becomes something that is utterly out of the way, while I believe that the perennial appeal of the play in so many different countries and through so many different centuries is much more likely due to the tragedy being in some sense representative and not exceptional. This obviously leads one, as the second interpretation to be commented on, to that of Sigmund Freud. I think that perhaps the most important right thing that Freud saw was that in some sense it is a tragedy that is not just about one man, but a tragedy that is about man in general. I don't think that Freud fully fathomed how representative the play is of the human condition, but at least he did call our attention to the way in which Oedipus is representative of all of us. And this he did, of course, in his first major work. It wasn't his first book, but his first major work, and the one that he considered, rightly probably, his greatest work, the interpretation of dreams, that first appeared in November 1899 with the date line, because the publisher thought that was more dramatic, 1900. And there he named the Oedipus complex after Oedipus, who had killed his father and married his mother. And he suggested, of course, that this is what men generally want at one stage in their development, to kill their father and marry their mother. He identified himself quite strongly with Oedipus, not only in this respect, but also because he thought that he had solved a great riddle. But he had sufficient humility and wisdom, after having made this point, and adding a footnote in which he suggested that this might also throw light on Hamlet, to complete this footnote by saying that every great literary work, just as also every neurosis, and just as also every dream, requires more than one interpretation to be fully understood. He did not make the mistake of believing that this one feature that he had called attention to was the explanation of Oedipus Rex. Rather, he thought that this was one consideration that threw light on it, and one consideration also that throws light on Hamlet's inability, reft though he is in killing Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to avenge the particular crime of the man who has killed Hamlet's father and married his mother, because this was something that Hamlet had himself wanted to do. If we look at it in this light as one consideration that helps us see something in Oedipus that otherwise we might not have noticed, it seems to me a very worthwhile suggestion. But to suppose that this is the riddle of the perennial appeal of Oedipus, that indeed would strike me as somewhat shallow. Not nearly so shallow, of course, as the interpretation offered by Erich Fromm, when he suggests that these three plays, of which I have so emphasized that they are not a trilogy, really are a trilogy, and that the theme that runs through, according to him, Oedipus Tyrannus and Oedipus on Colonus and the Antigone, is the relationship of the son to the father. It has nothing, he says, to do with incest. It is rather that the son has to grow up, and so these plays of Sophocles are interpreted each in turn as telling us what Fromm has so long been telling us in his books. I will not go into any detail about this particular interpretation because I find it so particularly unilluminating about Sophocles, though not about Fromm, and because I have dealt with it, as some of you will know, at some length in section 77 of my Critique of Religion and Philosophy, and there's no need to repeat here what I have said there. Let us turn next, and I want to talk only about two more interpretations, to a classical scholar, C.M. Bowrer, an Englishman, who has written a book, Sophoclean Tragedy, in which, in discussing Oedipus Rex, it seems to me he makes a number of good points, one of which at least goes most of the way toward making the first point that eventually I want to make about the play, the first of 5 I want to make about the play. One thing, for instance, that Bowrer points out is that for Oedipus' deed of unwittingly having killed his father and married his mother, some atonement is required according to Greek feeling about it, but not as harsh a punishment as he gets. And Bowrer suggests to us that the harshness of the punishment may be due to the curse that Oedipus had laid on himself. And of course, Oedipus himself says this in lines 819 and 20, where he speaks of this curse and says, "This same curse was laid on me, and laid by none but me." I will eventually read the curse and comment on it. In other words, early in the tragedy, before Oedipus realizes that he himself is the man who has committed the crime, he curses the man who has committed the crime, and Bowrer, rightly I think, calls our attention to the fact that this curse may itself be at least a contributory factor to the very severe punishment that then comes upon him. Secondly, Bowrer, in his treatment, calls our attention to something that I shall not elaborate now, but that is quite right, to some of the differences in plot between the Oedipus Tyrannus and the Oedipus and Colonus, where things are different. Thirdly, Bowrer suggests to us that Sophocles intended to show the gods at work. There is some theological interest in the play. This too seems right to me. And it seems very good to me when Bowrer finally concludes this part of his argument by saying, it is a warning not so much against pride as against any confidence or sense of security. This is practically the first point that I want to make, but I will elaborate that a little in a few minutes. And then Bowrer makes many other little points that I find helpful. One in particular, I think, is prominent in this play and can be found to some extent also in some of Sophocles' other plays, and that is that Sophocles has a way of letting his characters become so angry that they no longer understand when they are told the exact truth, which is a very representative observation about the human condition. And it certainly is a clue to understanding what happens in the Oedipus Tyrannus, because Oedipus is told the exact truth, but he cannot understand it because at that point he is so angry. And this surely was something that weighed importantly with Sophocles to show how anger, to put my own words now, blinds people. Lastly, let us turn to Aristotle. Aristotle not only says, but has led almost everybody who has thought and written about tragedy since his time to look at tragedy in this way, that there must be a hero, and that this hero must be a noble person with a hamartia, with some sort of tragic flaw, or some sort of crucial error of judgment. Now, Aristotle says specifically, moreover, and I gave some account of that 2 weeks ago, that this person must be an intermediate personage. He must neither be too good nor too bad. If he is too good, then it's odious to us that he should come to a tragic end. If he is too bad, then we are pleased to find him ending up badly, and therefore it's really that kind of a priori argument. The tragic hero has to be somewhere in between.